I have with me Mr. Yat Siu, the CEO of Animoca Brands.
The Metaverse is not Facebook. The Metaverse is not Meta, and it's not VR. The Metaverse is about digital property rights, and the Web3 is perhaps the most critical component, because only through Web3 can you actually own your digital property. We're technically digital immigrants, right? We sort of wandered into the virtual world, but we didn't come virtual. But for our children, they're absolutely virtual from day one. Their experiences are digital. It's their world. It's their playground.
Here at Token2049 Dubai, my name is Madiha Khan for Voice of Crypto, and right now I have with me Mr. Yat Siu, the CEO of Animoca Brands. So thank you so much for joining us right now.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
And I was just talking to you that you've just arrived over here. You missed the first day. So today you're seeing the day two where there's a lot of footfall. What is your experience like here in Dubai?
Well, I mean, the flight was heavily delayed, so obviously I missed the first day. But I have to say that the vibe is great here. We've arrived safely. The weather is actually great. Everything's pumping right now. Everyone's basically super excited. So very happy to be here in Dubai, here at Token2049.
That's great. Talking about Animoca Brands, as a CEO over there, you've been integrating digital property rights with NFTs and gaming. How do you think is this going to really bring about a change in the market?
Well, first, I think if we look at the comparisons of the physical world, when property rights was finally introduced, meaning that regular people could actually own their real estate or own their car or own their assets, and then they could derive the value of those assets. It created transformation, the capitalist transformation, where wealth was generated. Just think about how many people in the world today were able to generate generational wealth just because of the fact that they were able to own their house, right? Which is, by the way, it's not such an old concept, right? I mean, my parents' generation, for instance, in Asia, actually lost their homes, right, because of wars, or civil war, that kind of stuff, right? And I think we have many stories from certain parts of the world that have that. So we can't really take property rights for granted. But in the digital world, we don't have any property rights at all, right? Everything belongs to the platforms. People think that they own their customers or their followers on Instagram. They do not, right? People think that they own their game items in games. They do not, which is why also they don't have any true value attached to them. But in Web3, we can have digital property rights. And so for us, it's a revolution. If billions of people in the world that are online can actually own their data and the derivative of the data and the relevant network effects, it will be such a transformation for wealth generation for the world. It will also be a much fairer distribution, because now the same people who are creating the value, creators like you, who are making content, you're broadcasting it online, you're only getting from the platform perspective, only a small fraction of the value that they're generating from it. Actually, in Web3, you create much more fair value, and that is the future, because you are truly owning the property of your content, and the people who use your content have to pay you a fair share for that, which is what they don't have to do in Web2, because they control the platform, right? So we think it's going to be transformative. And, many people are worried about sort of the financial aspect. They say, oh, money, not sure, sounds a little bit off, but nobody disagrees that they should be owning the stuff. Nobody disagrees that you should own your IP, for instance, right? And they should own the work that you've done, and then derive the benefits from it. So we think it's going to be a massive transformation in the digital industry.
Well, it truly is. Talking about open metaverse, how do you think that in the coming time it's going to evolve and affect all of us?
Well, the open metaverse, I think, is fundamental, because it's how we experience our digital property rights. I think a lot of people got confused about the metaverse because they looked at Meta, as in Facebook. And when Meta wasn't doing so well, they thought the metaverse was doing well. And they also basically thought the metaverse was, VR headsets and AR and goggles and weird stuff like that, and spatial computing, what Apple is pushing. But those to us are just interfaces to the metaverse. They're not actually the metaverse itself. The metaverse begins with how we experience our own realities, which begins with owning our stuff, right? If we have property ownership of what we do, then we have a deeper connection. Just like in the physical world. You own your house, you take care of it, right? You invest in it, you plan for the long-term future. If you rent your home, you plan for the next 2 years, maximum, right? You won't spend as much on your furniture. You won't make it look quite as nice, because it's temporary. And I think that's the point. The open metaverse is a place that is your virtual space, that is your permanent virtual space, that you can truly invest for the long term. Your reputation, your assets, your existence, your social experiences, everything will be based on building in an open metaverse that is truly yours. And today, but for instance, NFT sales, which is basically the kind of digital property in the metaverse, does about $1 billion to $1.5 billion of monthly sales, which is basically not bad. But also, when you look at the treasuries of DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, they have over $30 billion of value currently in them, right, which is significantly higher than a year ago. And then if you look at the entire token space, which we think is essentially the economic engine of Web3, it's roughly $2.5 to $2.7 trillion, which is basically larger than most nations in the world, right? So I think of the open metaverse as this new emerging country that we can all immigrate to for new hope and opportunity, in the same way that at least my generation used to think of America.
True. You just mentioned about the identity that we hold, and a lot of times in Web3, we hear everybody saying that you have an identity and persona as a person, and then you also have an identity and persona as digitally. What do you think? What are the sort of ethical factors that come into picture from a user perspective over here?
Well, first of all, I would argue that even in the physical context, we have multiple identities, as in we have multiple personas. And I don't mean that we look different or act different necessarily, but we have different personas. When you think about maybe your high school friends, your university friends, your work friends, your family, maybe even if you have a partner, or friends are your partners, the reality is that we have different personas when we engage with these different communities. We're not exactly the same to all of them. And that's not to say that we want to be fake or something. It's to say that we engage with them different because maybe the energy is different, the relationships are different. And so we already have multiple personas, right? And it's not that uncommon, for instance, that you might be a friend with another friend whose friends don't interact with each other, right? You're like that bridge, but you're actually separated because you're actually, again, having a different persona. So I would say that people already live in different personas.
Yeah.
The online persona is just an extension of that persona. For instance, the many friends that people make online, they don't necessarily have physical friends with them. That doesn't mean your feelings, emotions are any weaker just because you're virtual versus physical. You see people making friendships online, finding their partners online, having romantic relationships online, right? Going as deep as that, right? So I would say that we maybe have to remove away from the thinking that there's one fixed persona. The face on your passport is not who you are. It is who you are in terms of your national identity, but it's not how you express yourself, right? You don't go to your friends and say, "This is my passport, so now you know who I am," right? You don't have to do that, right? You act differently. People know you maybe as a podcaster. Your family might know you as a child of your parents, right? Your school might know you as some student, and those are all personas that matter, right? So I think the key point, though, is that in all of those personas, a person acts authentically and builds reputation layers with them. So your reputation with your family. If you're bad on your reputation with your family, maybe your mom will kick you out, right? Right?
Yeah.
If you have a bad reputation with your friends, they might not invite you. It might not connect you to your network. If you have a bad reputation at work, you might not be able to find work anymore, right? So we all maintain these reputation layers. And I think this is what Web3 does, is that when you have things like an identity, like what we do with Mochaverse with Mocha ID, you create a reputation layer that you can now build on top of. And this is actually the key to, I think, the human social experience. Because the most important thing, I think, for people is your social reputation. I think when people talk about wealth, in terms of money sense, they really talk about their social reputation. Because social reputation and money is somewhat connected, although it doesn't always have to be. Like you could be a professor, but you could have great sort of reputation. You could be a Nobel Prize winner. You might not make as much money as Bill Gates, but you have a high social reputation. And it gives you basically a high self-worth and gives you the reputation that you want. And I think, how do you extend that reputation? I think Web3 does that very well. But again, I wouldn't say you need one. I think you have multiple. If someone goes out and is anonymous, and then every time launches a project with a new anonymous identity from scratch, not building on his past reputation, then I think that could be dangerous. I'm not saying it's bad, but you're not building on top of the reputation you had before, right?
Right.
Whereas if you build the reputation you had before, the more you build on those layers of reputation, actually the more you have to lose. And the more you have to lose, the more you have at stake. And that, again, I think is a principle that also exists in Web3, which is, what's your stake? If you have a big stake, I can trust you more. If you have a small stake, maybe I shouldn't trust you that much. Reputation is layered exactly the same way. If I have a big stake in my reputation because I've been working here for 20 years, or I've been a member of the society for a long time, or I've been a good member in my community, you don't want to lose that over something silly, right? And that, to me, is, again, how reputation is built. And how do you build a reputation at scale that you can trust? I think that's Web3 and blockchain. So I think this era where people are just calling out sort of the criticism of, I can be an anonymous person, That's okay, but I don't think that'll last for long. But you can be anonymous and build a reputation over 20 years, right? I mean, again, probably we will never get to see or know who Satoshi Nakamoto is, but if he was to ever truly emerge into the world anonymously by moving his wallet, he will have instant reputation, and he will have built that reputation, even for saying nothing, over the last decades because of what he has done or not what he has done specifically. Right?
I think you've portrayed this and explained it very very beautifully. Coming back to what we do, all of the traditional property rights that we have and like the digital assets like NFT or like NFT, bringing them together, what do you think are the kind of opportunities that are there, and at the same time, what do you think are the threats that you've faced and you're going to face?
So I think when you think of tokens, whether they're NFTs or fungible tokens, we think of them as containers of network value. So when people say, well, what's an NFT worth? The way that we look at an NFT, no different than we look at, let's say, physical assets, is that it has to do with the network effects they contain. So in other words, if you buy a Birkin bag or if you buy a Rolex watch, it may not seem immediately visible what the value is, but there's a network effect. That network effect isn't necessarily only translated into dollar value, it's translated into its reputation. So if someone bought a Rolex and they see it, they immediately know it signals some kind of wealth, maybe some kind of status, maybe some kind of image. Those are invisible network effects. Why are we drawn to celebrities? Because we want to attach ourselves to their network effects, right? So we think of everything as a kind of network effect. And tokens represent the power of these network effects, right? So that means that when you talk about how those become valuable, they need to be more fluid. They need to have more network effect. They need to have the ability for network effects to build on top of it, which means that tokens, whether they be NFTs or fungible tokens, have to be as free as possible. Because the more free they are, the more people can compose experiences, right? Bored Apes has its value, or Sandbox Land has its value because people build experiences on top of it. Right. Whereas items in Fortnite just don't have the same kind of value because they can only be used in Fortnite and that's it, right? Fungible tokens can cross bridge and cross liquidity across, and therefore they can also create more network effects and more network value as a result. So the biggest threat to me is the shrinking of these network effects, right? In other words, what actions, whether it's national countries, whether it's regulators that don't understand it, or whether individuals do to harm the network effects. Scams harm network effects, for instance, right? Or wrong regulation can harm network effects because they don't allow network effects to compose, right? They're not free to do so, right? So that type of stuff. So those would be the threats, right? And so we look at basically what projects have the ability to build more network effects more freely. So closed is a threat of open, right? So we would feel threatened if someone was going to build a closed metaverse, or someone trying to build an ecosystem that doesn't allow others to build on top, right? And that, so that I would say is the biggest issue. Like building closed versus open is always a threat. And so when you think about it, when there's negative regulatory action, like Hong Kong is very forward, for instance, right? But some countries might be very negative. Those countries that are being negative, they're basically shutting off network effects. They're restricting that, right?
When we talk about gaming in Web3, what do you think is the kind of potential that it holds, for evolution, and how do you think is it going to really shape up?
Web3 games is going to be massive. It already is massive. When you consider the size Web3 gaming has today, both the combination of revenue, token value, and liquidity, which is already in the tens of billions of dollars plus, right? Relative to the size of the market, and compare the fact that there's 3.4 billion people who play games, and basically only millions of people who play Web3 games, it is not hard to project that gaming is going to become $1 trillion opportunity because of Web3. And I think, again, this has to do with the freedom of these network effects. One of the reasons why Web2 games can't become as big as a Web3 game in terms of value, even though it seems they're bigger in terms of users, but not in terms of value, is because they don't have the ability to compose free network effects, right? If Fortnite does well, great for Fortnite. Nobody else cares, right? Only the company cares. Even the players don't care because they only have value from it, which means you're not actually empowering the network. When people talk about community, whether it's Web3 games or just Web3 or L1, L2s, what you're actually doing is you're empowering the community. In the last 3 years, $21.7 billion of value was dropped to communities through airdrops. Okay, I think most people don't really recognize just how much value is dropped. In a classic sense, when people say, "Oh my goodness, so much money was given to people, isn't that a waste?" No, you've empowered your community. You've given them the ability to form the network effects for you. You've enriched them to enrich the entire ecosystem as a result, right? And that to me is how actually we should build the world. So imagine what happens Today, when you advertise a game, which is $100 billion industry, you spend that money and you advertise with Google, Facebook, Apple to bring what? To bring customers to your game.
Right.
But the customers that you spent on Apple or Google to bring to your game, how much of that money went to the gamer? Zero. Okay? How much of the money that Apple and Facebook and Google got from you as a game company that was publishing it went to investing in your game or any game? Almost zero too. The point is that it's a huge value extraction. Now what happens when you take that money and you give it to the very people you want to engage in your game? First of all, they spend more, they're more grateful, they're more loyal, they experience property rights, and they become empowered. And that's why Web3 is so much more powerful, even though there's less number of users than Web2, because of this mechanism. And airdrop has been this mechanism to basically flip advertising upside down, to give value to the very customers you want to bring in anyway. I mean, if you could pay your customers directly to come to you, wouldn't you prefer to do that than to pay some intermediary a huge fee that doesn't even give you the customer you want?
True. I really want to talk a lot more when it comes to gaming, because I feel like we've played games since the advent of almost our age, human age, and especially once we went online.
Yes.
We always had something or the other that's there, and just to transform that into something where you earn rewards from is
Yes.
really something that's going to catch up. What do you personally feel now? There's something called as Play-to-Earn, which has been around for some time now to increase traction.
Yeah.
What do you personally feel about that?
I think Play-to-Earn is a component of ownership. It's not the only one, but it's an important component. But there's Play-to-Own, there's just the sort of social value of ownership, there's the fun part of gaming. These all are part of it. Play-to-Earn to me is a critical aspect of like the airdrop mechanism I mentioned to you, for instance, as well. But it's not the only one, right? But it's a narrative that wasn't possible before until you had Web3.
Yeah.
So it opened up these new kind of business models that you couldn't do before, right? And I think the other thing is that when you earn something in a game, like in a physical economy, you end up spending it back into the economy, right? And so I think this is the other aspect that people don't fully understand. That really it's aligning incentives. It's aligning incentives between the users, the creators, the game company, right? As well as the investors in the space, right? It creates complete alignment between them because all of them have a share in that value, right? Whereas again, in Web2, really the relationship with the customer is extractive, right? The customer is a customer because he's being extracted from. In Web3, it's not a customer, he's a stakeholder. He becomes a member of your community, which means you have to treat him differently. When gamers complain about a game in Web2, good luck that you can listen to, right? Because you don't have any kind of power to sort of reflect backwards. Whereas, in Web3, like it or not, if I'm not happy with the game, I can sell the assets. I can dump your tokens, I can dump your NFT if I really don't like you. And even though that may seem maybe just a financial instrument, it's actually a vote, right? It's the same as a customer saying, I'm not going to buy your product anymore, but it's more powerful. So it means you as a customer effectively has a way to sort of voice your disappointment, which forces the companies to work with you, to interact with you, right? Almost like a quasi-shareholder. But in Web2, you don't have to do that. So it empowers the end user and it makes them more connected. So I think all of these mechanisms are good. So Play-to-Earn, to me, it's just the alignment between the game and the end user. It's a component. It's critical, but it's not the most important thing. It's one of many things.
When we talk about gaming, the larger chunk that we are attracting are the younger population, the really naive minds. As stakeholders, how do you think should they be ethical, and what are the kind of responsibilities that that should be their framework?
So first, I think when it comes to Web3 ethics, of course you have to be ethical, but the point is that when you damage your reputation online, you have to start all over again, right? Because if you're known as a scammer, forget using that same identity. And I think we're seeing that kind of action because on-chain, everything is recorded. So I think that's the first part, right? The second thing is that I think for young gamers, the most important thing that I think Web3 gaming can do is bring financial literacy. Because when you're playing a game, we learn through play, historically, right? I mean, our children learn by looking at us as adults. And we the most important thing we learn at school isn't actually math or science. It's socializing, it's interacting with others, it's having empathy, right? And if you think about the kind of leaders that we like to follow, we follow the leaders who have the best social skills, who are most empathetic, who understand us. not the ones who are, the greatest mathematicians or the greatest scientists. They're good at what they do, but they tend to probably work very well between small groups of similar like-minded people and not necessarily have empathy to everyone else because they're in their particular bubble. And we all need different types of people. But my point is that social skills, empathy are sort of really critical. And that's what you learn really in the social setting in school, for instance, right? So they learn it through play. And what is a new form of play? It's digital. You play online. You play on Roblox. You play on Minecraft. You play on Sandbox. Those are the experiences that you play online and basically live your life. So the one component that we can now do is as you play in these virtual spaces, you can now learn one of the most important social systems in the world, money.
Right.
Money is probably the most important system in the world that we don't teach. Our children do not learn about it, even though they know arithmetic, they can learn math, they can learn algebra, they can learn high-level physics, but they can't balance their books. I mean, that's insane, right? They have to pay crazy credit card interest because they don't understand compound interest. And that happens because they've been kept ignorant. So I think part of the key roles of Web3 gaming is if we can learn and remember Pokemon cards and Roblox lore and all these things, we can certainly teach them about financial sort of literacy, about investment, about money. And imagine a world where all of our children are mostly educated about money. What will the world look like? Totally different. I think much better.
I think that's one of the most biggest highlights that you have sort of pointed out, where we can educate our children really young at age. And I also feel that in the coming generation is going to make a lot more mark in the Web3 industry as what the current generation
well,
is
it's their world.
doing.
I mean, they're digitally natives. People like myself who are a lot older, we're technically digital immigrants, right? We sort of wandered into the virtual world, but we didn't come virtual.
Right.
But for our children, they're absolutely virtual from day one. Their experiences are digital. It's their world. It's their playground.
And while we can always sit and talk about the ill effects of it, we can always work towards making that world better, because that world is it is the reality.
Absolutely.
Talking about your work in Hong Kong, you've been a part of the task force that's sort of bringing Web3 together. Tell us about some of the initiatives that you've taken or that have been taken.
Well, I mean, first, Hong Kong already now has advanced some of the stablecoin regulations and thoughts, put consultation papers out. We have now approved the Bitcoin and Ethereum spot ETF, first in the world, I would say. It's already had Bitcoin futures earlier before. We have tokens that are traded, basically on the consumer side. We have 2 regulated exchanges approved in Hong Kong, for instance, and a lot has been happening. And recent events like Web3 Festival and sort of, all the other type of Web3 events that have happened in Hong Kong in the last really 1.5 years, including things like ApeFest and so on that came to Hong Kong, have really sort of demonstrated that I think Hong Kong is actually really competing with Dubai, I think, on the global stage of wanting to become a major Web3 hub, which is good. I think, you need competition to keep the ecosystems on. So of course, other parts in Asia, like Japan, Tokyo, and so on, are pushing forward as well. But I mean, Hong Kong has really sort of demonstrated that leadership. And we see the energy. We're headquartered in Hong Kong, and we see the benefits of the talent that wants to move there, the kind of government support. The government also has a Web3 marketing fund for, basically, if you want to run an event in Hong Kong, you can potentially get funding from the government to do that. There's not many countries in the world that have a dedicated Web3 fund, and a whole bunch of Web3 startups that have all emerged out of Hong Kong. So I think Hong Kong is a really exciting place. They kind of get it. They want to remain relevant in the fintech world and the financial world, and they recognize that focusing on Web3 and promoting and supporting Web3 is a big part of that.
That's great. The regulations and policies change from country to country. So how do you think is Hong Kong, and especially I'm talking from a regulations and policies and compliances perspective, is going to bring about a sort of change, or going to set the path for other countries in Web3?
So I think when you look at Hong Kong, you have to look at Hong Kong not simply as its own place, but also as an extension of China. Whatever Web3 policy that Hong Kong is doing has an impact, obviously, for Chinese policy as well, because obviously I think what Hong Kong is doing isn't happening in a vacuum. It has to be blessed somehow, right? That doesn't mean that you should expect crypto to be available freely in China, but it's to say you could look at some of the history that Hong Kong, for instance, has been acting as a gateway for financial services to the rest of the world in and out of China. You could expect that Hong Kong will play a similar role in Web3 and fintech related stuff. That's the first point. The second one is Hong Kong is one of the biggest financial centers in the world. right? On top, up there with like New York, Tokyo, and London, and so forth. And so that means that whatever Hong Kong does will be noticed around the world. The Hong Kong Stock Exchange is one of the top 5 exchanges in the world, for instance, right? So whatever financial services and impact and regulation that happens in Hong Kong, the rest of the world is going to say, oh, we should take a look at that, and we should study that and understand whether that makes sense, right? And I think it adds value to the entire ecosystem also because other regulators who want to look at it can learn from the lessons of Hong Kong as they've learned from lessons from Dubai or Singapore in the past.
That's great. If I have to ask you, I just want to understand a little bit about you as a person. You've been in the industry for such a long time. You've done such commendable work. Is there, say, a particular learning that you sort of learned the hard way, but you want to just showcase and help us with that, so we could learn from the mistakes?
I don't know if there's, first of all, mistakes are made on a daily basis. I look at mistakes or failures really as lessons, right? I think the key thing is don't try to make the same mistake twice, right? But there's so many lessons to learn. Also, the space changes. So whatever is true yesterday might not be true today, right? So I think you sort of have a flexible and open mind. But I would say, if there was one lesson that I would want to share with everyone in the community is really you should build with impact and purpose, right? Meaning that when you're building a product or service, it may have a certain direction, but if you know what your North Star is, you're building for a particular purpose, and you want to create a particular impact, then you're able to navigate those storms and those sort of meandering rivers much more easily than if you only had one particular goal in mind. Like a lot of people, for instance, build in a space just focusing on money, right? And that's fine. I understand the motivation because money will give you certain social advancements and maybe buy a better house, but that can be done many ways, right? If your purpose is to make only money, then you can switch from project to another project to another project. And we've seen founders, very talented founders, who switch from Web3 to AI to Web3, right? Or VCs who fund Web3 to AI to Web3, right? For the same reason, because they're basically chasing one goal, which is returns. But if you're really driven, like in our case, we're driven to deliver a world for digital property rights, really for the last 6 years. And the last 6 years, has been all sorts of ups and downs when you think about it, right? But we continue to steadfastly build in that vision because we believe in the greater purpose. And if you can build in a purpose that you feel is greater than your own, then that's how you can get up at every day, even when the weather isn't so good, even when it's the stormiest of weathers, you will somehow overcome because you realize it's greater than you, right? So I would say that for every founder out there, if you can try to find a big why, then I think you are already more than halfway there.
That's really great. I also resonate with what you've just said, and I also believe that it's very important to have your North Star, no matter what you do, so that even though you're working in different fields, you know what you're working for. Yes. By the end of the day.
And you'll find different ways to get there, yes. Because maybe the way you thought you'll get there doesn't work, but it doesn't matter. You'll find another way. Like for instance, we knew that digital property rights in gaming would be big, but we didn't realize in 2017 and 2018 that we needed DeFi to get there, right? As an example, right? And so all these things happen, and then you have to experience and navigate those spaces so that you see your vision come to reality based on how the market changes. As long as you don't lose your North Star, you'll always find a way.
That's great. I also sometimes, get a little frustrated when I don't see enough and more people around me having a North Star, using their responsibilities more responsibly. So yeah, that's a learning curve personally. What I want to understand from you is, a piece of advice that you'd want to give to especially the extremely young minds who are just sort of, entering the industry or are wanting to make it big in the industry. What's the one piece of advice you'd give them?
Well, the one big advice I would give to anyone in this space is not to give up. Because it's easy to give up and move somewhere else, and maybe you got to do what's right for you. But if you really believe in this space and you're excited about it, you'll have to recognize that there's going to be bumps in the road, which, by the way, is life, right? Life is full of bumps in the road, right? And I think if you keep at it, then eventually you'll find a deeper purpose. Because I think one of the struggles, I have children, and one of the struggles that children have is they'd love to find their purpose on day one. They'd have to be born to know exactly what they want, but maybe they don't know that. And I would say, for me, it took decades of life experiences, living in different countries, doing different jobs, doing different startups, for me to understand this moment that we're in right now and why I think it's important for me and for what I can share for the world. But, if you'd asked my 20-year-old self, I'd have a different view, but it wouldn't be what I have today. that 20-year-old self and 30-year-old self was simply the stepping stone to where I was today. And I think if we understand that we're eventually constantly achieving to get to that point, that there is not an end point, as in there's no end point in life in a traditional sense. Your purpose doesn't have an end point itself. I mean, who knows? Maybe the experiences I'm building with Animoca Brands might actually end up evolving into something different or larger or greater that we hadn't foreseen. You can't ask my 20-year-old self to know what I was doing today. But if you're earnest and authentic in your action, then you're building basically a layer of experience that will help you find who you are in the future.
Clearly, do the best that is possible in that scenario.
That's right.
That's the focus.
Yes.
One final thing is, in the world of Web3, we have so many concepts, so many jargons. So I would want you to pick any one concept or a jargon and sort of explain it to our audience. It's like a small tutorial bit, anything that you think is sort of misinterpreted, or you'd want to debunk it.
Well, maybe the biggest thing I'd like to debunk is the Metaverse is not Facebook. The Metaverse is not Meta, and it's not VR. The Metaverse is about digital property rights, and the Web3 is perhaps the most critical component, because only through Web3 can you actually own your digital property in the open Metaverse.
That is very well explained. Thank you so much for having such a long and insightful conversation with us, and all the very best I'm actually extremely taken and blown away with the kind of thought process that you have, because I truly resonate with these kind of thoughts of having ethics in life and morality no matter what you do. It was really nice talking to you about all of this.
It was a great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.